Hello, and welcome to Utah Tech Lead's Complex Conversation Series. Today, we are with Sunny Washington, the founder and CEO of Seer. Hi, Sunny. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's fun to be back.
Always. So, for those of you who don't know, Sunny is our former CEO and our current board chair. So, we have a lot of love and work quite literally two doors down the hallway from each other. It's wonderful. We see each other all the time. But today we're here to talk about drama and scandals and political nonsense. Sunny, what's caught your eye lately?
Well, it's hard to ignore some of the latest with AG Sean Reyes, what's going on there. Um, I think, I mean, there's obviously a ton of stuff happening on the national level with George Santos and everything. I don't know for this conversation if we just want to hear focus locally, but I'd say like that's probably the biggest upset and what's been going on with OUR and the associations and use of the office, the state office to help with some of those initiatives.
And Sean Reyes has been a particularly public attorney general. I think we've seen a lot of him throughout the different election cycles, including as a Trump supporter. Whether you love or hate Trump, doesn't matter. But Sean Reyes has been on the front line for that. He flew to Arizona for some elections fraud stuff. He's been all over the country. And now I believe he was recently elected the chair of GOP AGs because acronyms. Why the hell not? But it is a really interesting situation because, especially in Utah, for whatever reason, for the past 23 years or so, our attorney generals have not been able to keep themselves out of the muck.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about it because I was like, do we just have bad luck with AGs? Because there has been, but I think Liz, it would be helpful if people like this whole Shurtleff and John Swallow and all of that. Yeah, just like I think it's like the last 13 year or the last three AGs we've had there's been some sort of political scandal.
Absolutely. So I have a little timeline here, and I'll just kind of read some of this off. So Mark Shurtleff, who was arrested, charged, and then had the case thrown out, he was originally elected in 2000, and then he was reelected in 2004. So he had 4 good years, 4 years with absolutely no complaints. And then in 2005, there were questions around a prosecution of his and whether or not it was a political favor for a party donor. So he continues on his merry way. There's lots of drama. There's always drama, especially with public figures. So, props to them for putting up with that. But then his successor was a guy named John Swallow, who didn't even make it a full 12 months in office. He was accused of all sorts of fraud and problems. And the LG, who I believe at the time was actually our current governor, had prepared a report that said that he had broken election laws. And in November of 2013, so he won his 2012 election, was sworn in 2013, and in November, just before Thanksgiving, he told the world that he was resigning effective the first week of December. And that's how we actually got Attorney General Sean Reyes, was that this second iteration after John Swallow, Reyes was appointed December 30th by Governor Gary Herbert. And it has been a very interesting ride for, say the past 20 years or so. So how much do you know about those scandals? I'm sure everybody's heard of something about them.
I don't know a lot other than like I remember it. I don't think I was closely following kind of the Utah what was happening, but I do remember the names and the news stories. I understand it got pretty nasty. And there were a lot of you know uh there were a lot of repercussions for that. So then what you hope, and I think the problem is always when you have a position like that where someone's elected, but then also like their job is to kind of be upholding the state constitution and the country's constitution. It makes it really hard when you hear about these things, almost like you just are like, you're supposed to be better than this.
Well, it seems from his recent writing exposure in his sequel to what was that movie called? The Sound of Freedom. And now I think it's like The Cries of Freedom is supposed
The
to be the
cry of freedom. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, he very much seems to think that he is presenting himself on a national stage in a very forward manner. There was actually a time in, I think it was 2016, where AG Reyes went to a Sundance party, like the biggest, like end of Sundance party, I think it was. And he claimed to be undercover, which is really interesting because he was wearing a beanie and a t-shirt in Park City. Like he was still Sean Reyes, right? Like it was
Is that being undercover?
yeah, and like there was a reporter that was with him, like interviewing him in this like undercover activity. And like a couple weeks later, Sean Reyes actually admitted that he probably was at the wrong party because it was like the most secure and the most attended party. So clearly his undercover work for human trafficking in Park City during Sundance was
Oh,
less,
is that why he was there? Like he was on the job? Like he was, oh, okay, yeah.
because a lot of lawyers who represent the state or private clients are often also investigators trying to trap people, apparently.
So let me ask you this, because I just don't know. Because like I understand, like, in some of uh the elected positions, like our legislature, a lot of them have full-time jobs, and this is very much like a part-time thing. Um, the AG, this is a full-time job. So like are there rules around like what you can do as for your side hustles? Or like, can you drive an Uber and like DoorDash too? Like what
So
are the rules?
I think that's one of the really interesting things that the current audit of the AG's office by the state legislature is trying to figure out. Like,
Mm,
where are the boundaries and did you cross any? Because we really don't have a lot of boundaries in the state of Utah at the state level. We don't have campaign contribution limits. We have very sparse ethical rules and regulations for behavior, which is honestly one of the reasons why many of the charges that were filed against the former two AGs were thrown out because it wasn't against state law to do what they did, which is crazy
mm.
because they were arrested because of course they were like that's and more interestingly though for me is that even when we know that there is corruption here in the state, we end up paying them. So the state approved a settlement with Mark Shurtleff for $600,000 and paid him after the fact. So they had a failed prosecution and then the state ends up paying him. So it's not like a failed conviction or a wrongful conviction. There was prosecution, there was supposed to be a trial,
Yeah,
it got
yeah.
thrown out, and then the state ends up paying him. And then after that, the state ended up paying John Swallow $1.5 million. So a guy who didn't even make it a year in his elected position, who committed election fraud, I should rephrase that. That's a hot topic right now. Election contribution fraud,
Uh-huh.
was then given $1.5 million of state taxpayer funds by the state of Utah.
I think like I mean, listen, I think like it's so fun to read about like different scandals and things like that. I mean, I love reality TV just as much as the next person. And then when you know the local players, it makes it like far more interesting. I think that's the challenge I think a lot of people have, or maybe it gets a little bit frustrating is just the amount of resources that goes to addressing these things because I'm kind of like yeah, like if I'm going to represent an office, just knowing like that, people are going to know who you are and all of these things, it would seem like you would want to be on your best behavior. And then when you're not, like whether there's settlements or charges or even just like disruption to um the department itself, like that becomes really frustrating. I was looking and I was like, okay, like how big is the AG's office? And I mean, they operate on a 42 plus $1 million budget. They have a lot of AGs. I know some AGs that work there. They're really phenomenal people. And I was like, I can't imagine that it's fun for them to try and do their job and have to deal with this. And with, their head having been involved in a scandal like this.
Especially those who've stayed around for a while. Like if you have any kind of seniority at that office, I can only imagine that you've lived through several scandals and kept your head above water and been able to do the work. But it's really disconcerting when the top of your organization is now all of a sudden under investigation or being sued for God only knows what, I mean, I feel like every couple of months there's something new that we're dealing with when it comes to state agencies. There's actually right now, we are settling a lawsuit with the federal government because many of our state agencies defrauded the federal government from 2009 to 2015, claiming that they had job losses and all these other things and that they needed money from the feds, the people that we
Yeah.
like to crap on all year long. So they stole money from the federal government, all these different agencies, and there were multiple agencies. So clearly there seems to be some sort of culture where we are dealing with these scandals pretty regularly. And one of the things that I find the most interesting, there was a study done by the IMF, the Monetary Fund, about how political scandals actually impact a state's economy. And that was wild to me because I honestly, everybody, like you mentioned, like it's reality TV, right? Like everybody loves smut and to read about drama and to kind of go into these places and think about how they would respond or how they would act and if they were put in these specific situations. But in all reality, we often, especially in our industry, don't think about the impact that it has to funding. And that IMF study was super, super clear that people and firms do not invest in places where there is economic instability created by its elected officials. So if you're trying to raise money right now out there, startups, if you're trying to raise money for a fund and you're trying to figure out why people keep saying no to you, this might actually be it. Have you heard about any of those kinds of activities, or has it been more difficult for you or others to kind of get money right now? I know everything's tight, but do you think this could be a contributing factor?
I think what it does is, I can't like say with any like exact evidence of what the economic impact from where I've seen, with companies. That being said, I think what it is just when there is distrust in the people that are running, creating policies, making laws, defending the law, all of that, it makes it really difficult to say, like, oh, this is a spot. Because, yes, you want to look for, there's a variety of reasons why people might invest in a state like Utah or, want to build companies. It's like, you know, um, talent, it's, opportunity, the economic, uh, uh, outlook, the housing, all of these things come into play. But when you feel like maybe people can't be trusted, I think that makes it really difficult. You would probably want to go where you're most familiar. That being said, like I think that one of the things that it has been really eye-opening to me is just like finding information about, like, because like we hear these names and you're like, okay, well, I saw this news clip or I saw this story or whatever, but you want people to have information so that they can kind of understand like what the implications are. But I think our attention span is so short that like actually finding that information can be quite difficult. But like, yeah, like, sometimes like the minute I see something a little funny, I'll go in and look at their campaign contributions and I'll be like, that's why they voted that way, or that's why they supported that bill, or that's why they're saying this, because it seems so out of left field. And when you start to understand, for what drives an individual, sometimes it's political power, sometimes it's because they genuinely want to serve their community and serve their constituents. But sometimes when it's just like a little weird, all you have to do is like follow the money, and you're like, that makes sense.
Yeah, and in our work with different elected officials, it's been really interesting to have the conversation about when I worked at the House, we called it the trib test. A lot of people call it the sniff test. If it smells like poop, it's because it's poop, guys. It's poop. But when I was at the House, we called it the Trib test. And it's like, do you really want this splashed over the front page of the Salt Lake Tribune? And when we're talking about recruiting, we're talking about people who are like Googling Utah and trying to see what they might potentially be moving into. And when all of these scandals are the top of the news, it becomes a huge, huge problem because people don't want to go to places that are unstable. People don't want to go to places where they don't have a chance. And realistically, especially when you talk about those statewide office holders, you're talking about a lot of money when it comes down to it. You're talking about election money, you're talking about their salaries, you're talking about all of this different kind of influence that money has, rightfully so, but that can be negatively impacting their decisions. So if someone like Walmart donates a ton of money to someone, then we run into this issue that, maybe smaller grocers are pushed out. And when we're talking about the tech industry and you're talking about small startups who have this idea or who are attempting to really make movement in a specific area or specific industry, you can run into the exact same thing. They can get pushed out by strange regulation. I think we experienced this with Neighbor several years ago. The company Neighbor was in constant contact with the state and city and county fire marshals because traditional storage units were calling in complaints. And at one point, the fire marshal themselves were setting up stings on the Neighbor platform to claim that this was an unsafe practice and that it was unregulated because it wasn't a storage unit. It wasn't a traditional storage unit. So we actually had to change the law to say that it didn't have to be exactly what you think of when you think of those really weird, creepy, silent hallways where you shove all of the stuff that you think you need but don't actually look at for 10 years, So it does come to this effectual situation where we might not understand it now, but there's a possibility that venture funds stop flowing like they have been. And I feel like they've been flowing in spite of what we've been doing. So there's a possibility that all of this comes to a head in the next year or so, and all of our companies kind of run dry. And these are good folks doing good work.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I have found is like how little money it might take to like, influence here. And I remember the first time even just writing a check to a candidate, like I was like, this feels gross and weird and everything like that. And I was talking to a friend of mine, and she was going to a fundraiser, and I was like, so this is what you want to do? Like, you want to write a check, and you're gonna like physically hand it to them. And she's like, this is so weird, and it's because like I get like in political circles and campaigns and things like that, like that's just what you do. But usually like when we're giving someone money, especially if you're a venture fund, it's because you believe in this person or their company, or you believe in some sort of outcome. You're betting on this person because they have shown you something that is important to you, whatever that objective is. Sometimes like the campaign stuff just feels like, oh, just because they're them, they get money, and even if you don't really like them, but you have to like, grease the skids a little bit. It does feel a little gross and weird and everything. And I still don't know if it will ever like sit well with me. I get like people are like, no, that's just how you do it. But I do think that one of the things is there are real dollars and real repercussions to these things. And when we're in a state where we continually to be one of the lowest in per student funding, or we have big issues like the Great Salt Lake and air quality and all these things, and homelessness, and we can't put nearly enough resources to it. You have to think, well, what is being reserved for lawsuits and settlements and all of this for bad behaviors? And even just doing things that aren't always the most cost efficient, and I think that's the difference between government and businesses who have limited resources are forced to be cost efficient. And sometimes it's just such a big budget, it's just hard to know if that the dollars are being spent in the ways that we would actually want to make our state better.
So I'm going to read this to you. This is from an Investopedia article. The quality of education and healthcare also deteriorates under a scandalous economy, leading to an overall lower standard of living for the country or state's citizens.
Yeah, that's not surprising to me. Yeah.
Because honestly, when our front page is all filled up with very specific political scandals, it's really, really hard to focus on like the well-being and the needs of everybody, right? Like it makes it a lot more difficult because instead, to be completely honest, we're here talking about the most recent drama in Utah, right? So we're talking about that instead of talking about, the housing affordability crisis or the diversity issues or, the lake drying up, like you mentioned. Like it's definitely something that's interesting to talk about, but it's also something that people don't realize can also take over conversations, useful conversations that don't require as small as a $250 check.
Yeah.
You can have those conversations as long as your situation is filled with trust. And there's not a lot of trust in the AG's office from the general public right now. I think we've seen that time and time again. It's hard when you have different people arrested and trials beginning, and you're just kind of like, okay, cool. And on the current attorney general's website, it even says restore public trust in the office as one of their like 4 goals for his term in office.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of research that talks about, how important a leader is. And if there is, just even among the team, I would imagine he's got hundreds of employees working, at the office. And so this kind of stuff doesn't help, to restore trust, especially, I mean, it's like a large company, right? You can't make sure to have personal relationships with a team that size. But, it just makes me wonder, can someone recover from something like that? And what does it take? Like I just, it's the kind of thing where, you could probably make more money in the private sector and not have that kind of scrutiny on your life.
Yeah.
So, like there's something attractive about being in that position that you take lower pay, and maybe it's, you know, your desire to serve the community. But for some other people, I think it also opens inroads for future careers and future, objectives you might have, whether you want to be a screenwriter or be president of the United States, it becomes a stepping stone to what that is.
Don't forget the MMA fighter. That was definitely one of the ones where I was like, cool. Yeah. One kick and that guy would go down so hard. It wouldn't take much at all. So if you don't know what we're talking about, you should follow Adam Hurwitz. I don't know how to say his last name. Hopefully that's correct on Twitter, or just go to the Fox 13 website. It's a really interesting read on how the current attorney general feels about
Listen, hats off to anyone who's a screenwriter that, wants to attempt. But like, good God, I hope he did that on his free time. So,
Well, I'm not even sure how he has free time. Like, I'm not sure that that man can go to the bathroom by himself, and not because of young children, but purely because of all of these other things that he seems to have his hands in. Like, it is crazy. There are some screenshots about how he was already spending a week in Spain, so he couldn't go to a movie premiere in Colombia. And I'm like, how? Like,
so I mean, I don't know, because when I was like, okay, what is the AG? They protect, they defend the state constitution and the country's constitution. Like outside of that, it feels like a very much like I gotta stay local, and work on the initiatives. Who sets the agenda for what his work like, or is that, us because he's an elected official, so we help guide that.
wouldn't that be nice if it was us? If voters got to determine what the AG works on and what they don't. The AG's office has a number of different ways of actually setting their own agenda. There is legislative priorities, priorities from the governor, as well as internal priorities. So lots of times when a new attorney general gets elected, the office already has an ongoing task force or ongoing commission that is specifically looking into issues of importance to the state. And so that work tends to continue. There are so many different offices within the Utah Attorney General's office. It's kind of crazy. It's also really difficult to find what active litigation is actually going on in that office at any given moment. There's no easy link. There's no easy way to find it. I still haven't found a full list, and I've been searching for days at this point. But for instance, like the opioid epidemic, that was a national lawsuit that we were a part of. But our social media lawsuit that we are currently embroiled in,
Right.
like that's a big deal, because that deals not just with damage to kids, which is what the message is, like social media damages kids, but the side of that is legal definitions of what a social media company is, which we have run
Mhm.
into those problems, right? There was a piece of legislation 2-3 years ago that said a platform with user contributed content. And if a judge somehow in a ruling manages to revamp the better language that we worked on and came up with, it makes it so much more difficult for innovative entrepreneurs to start companies here. Like, you don't know if your company is all of a sudden going to be labeled a social media company, even though that's not what you're doing, right? You're just a random SaaS company who maybe helps restaurants or something. Like, it's kind of crazy, the different things that we have to deal with here and the different things that are defended. Like, it's very, very strange to me for any of our elected officials who are not actively campaigning to
Mhm.
create such a broad stage for themselves. And I think that there is a lot of validity in the leadership aspect of that, of Utah leading the nation on X, Y, and Z. But when it comes down to your particular office, I think that leadership should be limited to those specific issues that are identified either by your office or by your staff. Like, that's got to be something, right? Like, the governor isn't flying all over the country to talk about election fraud. He's not blowing everybody up. I mean, he's got his disagree better, whatever thing that he's got going, but he's also not consistently leaving the state for other issues or consistently leaving the state for other side work. And it is one of those questions where it's like, okay, what are the rules about side work when you are a state employee? Because the federal level has very clear rules about that. But the
Yeah,
state,
and I was like noticing too, like like the Supreme Court and the US Supreme Court, and just the lack of trust and confidence in the Supreme Court. So then they're like, oh, okay, let's come up with like an ethics, guidelines or whatever, rules or whatever. I just, and then a lot of times when you're like, people will say, oh, you don't like it. Well, get them out of office or get a new, elect someone else. It is so hard. So then, like, I think sometimes people think that, like, by blasting online or the news media is enough to, hold someone accountable. I don't know. Sometimes it might work. I think sometimes it doesn't. And I think it depends on the scandal. I don't know if Reyes survives this. I don't know. Um, what do you think?
I don't know if he survives or not. I wouldn't be surprised if he just absolutely refuses to back down. You know what I mean? Like, I think that that is just in his personality to be the kind of person who fights back, which isn't
He is an
necessarily.
MMA fighter, so yeah. Yeah.
Sure. I've seen a lot of videos of him rapping. I've literally never seen a video of him fighting. So if you have him, share him. That could be really, really interesting. But I think that it brings up a really interesting point, right? Because Utah's most recent elections, like, for those of you who live outside of Congressional District 2, congratulations, you were not subjected to the incessant text messages and mailers and outreach and phone calls and random teenagers knocking on my door trying to explain to me the values of people that I've known for years and that this child has not ever met. Yeah, so consider yourself lucky, but also Chris Stewart stepped down, right? That's the whole reason we had to have a special election in our congressional district too. And then we have to have a special election that is in line with the way that our laws are already written. So if there's a primary, we have to have a certain distance of time, right? And there was not enough time to hold our elections on the normal Tuesday in early November. So it had to be pushed to right before Thanksgiving. And gratefully, we're a mail-in ballot state, so that makes it significantly easier. But that costs taxpayers money too. Like millions of dollars went into adjusting all of those schedules and those printing runs and everything else that you can imagine, including staffing. And it's just, to be honest, it's kind of silly. It's completely and totally unnecessary. And Representative Stewart's reasoning is not factual either. His wife being sick was not the issue that he was resigning for. He was resigning to open his own lobbying firm. Different bag of Skittles there.
But if that was the case, like, why wouldn't he just pick a different time, like resign sooner?
Or
So that it could be within like, fine, you don't want to do this anymore. That's fine. Like, people have a choice. But like, why wouldn't you, say, okay, well, then I'm gonna resign sooner. So if it's in line with the regular election, so we don't have to pay extra costs for that.
That's a great question. And that's one that only he could answer, I believe. And I think that he would be too busy with his new clients to give you a response. But we've had several of those kinds of situations. When Jason Chaffetz resigned, there was a bunch of problems between who actually got to replace him and how that replacement happened. And they clarified it, but it was a good 6 months of additional meetings. And people think, oh, it's just a meeting, no big deal. But this means you have legislators and county commissioners and county elections and county clerks and all of these people regularly coming to the Capitol building. And that costs money. Like, it costs so much money. Every time we have a special session, there's at least one reporter who finds out exactly how much that 1 day special session is going to cost above and beyond what they normally pay for whatever is happening at the moment. And it costs everyone money. And it's, I think I just miss the days when elected officials were quiet people who did work.
Yeah, I think right now it's like all the media attention is like so much, people want the headline, and that's what's getting a lot of play, and then it's being amplified through social media platforms and all of that. But it is kind of like, good God, we got shit to do. We don't have time for this. You're wasting people's time and resources. So it is definitely, like, there's this like, oh, government moves slow. Well, could it move faster? If we had focused on, we weren't doing the things that don't actually help the objective. I just think that that's the thing that is a little frustrating to me, because I saw how many people like were, got not all the funding that they had hoped for, like really important programs in our state, or we ran out of time to discuss people's important legislation and things like that. And it's like, but what are we wasting instead of doing the stuff that really does matter?
And I think that is a really interesting connection with why tech, who is probably at this point the #1 industry employer in the state, tends to stay away from it. It's gross, it's dirty, it's exhausting, it doesn't make any sense. There are better ways to do things. And especially when you're in tech, your job is to find a problem and fix it, right? So there's something wrong, and you build a company around fixing that something wrong. And then most founders tend to do that multiple times over the years. And you can't do that if you're even paying attention, right? So I intentionally wasn't paying attention to a lot of the drama surrounding the Operation Underground Railroad founder, Tim Ballard. I was just like, I don't have the time. I don't have the emotional energy. I'm not doing it. And I didn't pay attention until Reyes was mentioned. And then I started to pay attention because we've all heard those rumors about Sean Reyes and about his inclination to chase validation in different ways, and this being one of those ways. And it's a problem, right? Because the more that tech puts their head down and just works on what they're doing, the less control they have over what's happening around them. And it's like this, it's almost like this bubble that's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And now you can't breathe, and it's like right on your face, and you can't understand why you can't breathe. And it's because those guys over there have been making up all of these rules around you that are just tightening the strings for this bubble, right? And it's now squeezing you, and you can't move, you can't do anything that you were trying to do because you decided to just focus on that one thing. It's a huge problem.
Yeah, I think like that's the one thing that I noted, just like based on like previous experience where, spending time with you at the Capitol and all that, it was like, it was just a totally different world where like the rules and everything was just operating on a different, they weren't business rules necessarily. It was like, oh no, there's these processes and there's a state constitution and you have to do this and it's because of code and this is why it's done. And once I started to understand that, I was like, oh, okay. So like when I get on Twitter or X or whatever it's called, and I'm like dissatisfied and I call out my rep on Twitter, that actually doesn't do anything or doesn't make an impact, or I'm frustrated with this piece of legislation, and I don't know what to do, but I'm going to email my rep, but it doesn't even seem like that even works. I think that's the thing that people, the worst thing we can have is people being apathetic, because we do care about schools and education and the air we breathe and, all these things. And just knowing that like there are so many people up there that are, pulling the puppet strings and like orchestrating all of that. And if you can't trust them to do the right thing, it makes it really hard to say, oh, this is an area that we want to continue to invest in. But I also think too, and that's why we started SEER, was to really kind of bring out that transparency, because I think that that's, it's high time we had that in an easy way for people to access. But like right now, other than kind of laugh at the screenplay, what are we supposed to do?
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really important question. Like, what are we supposed to do? So I'm just going to throw it out there. If any of you watch Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, but you don't vote, I'm calling you out right now. You are part of the problem. You can continue to watch Real Housewives. Feel free, watch all of them. I don't care. But if you're paying attention to reality television more than you're paying attention to reality, you may or may not need therapy, and you absolutely should be engaged in your local community, because that is how we solve the problem, right? We decide, instead of having this closed system of pay to play, we then invest in individuals, we invest in industries, and we invest in products that we think are worthwhile. And I think, honest to God, that government as a whole could learn so much from industry that they currently do not have. And some of it's because in their full-time jobs, they weren't decision makers. Some of it was because they operated in a similar system in their full-time jobs, whether that was previously or while they're currently serving. I think there's lots of ways that we can push for things to happen, and we need to push for it. So, I mean, you mentioned the Supreme Court ethics rules that they wrote for themselves and are garbage. So there's that, right? Like, how do we make sure that the things that we're asking for are actually done? And that takes time, and it takes energy. And it might be energy that you don't feel like you have, but it is energy that you have to have. You have to, for the future of the state, for your kids, for your grandkids. There's no way to solve the problems that we're seeing now. And we're going to get the Olympics, guys. Can we just not have an AG who's under some sort of investigation in 2034? Like, that would be great. I would love, when we have the international stage again, that we are recognized for being one of the largest and most efficient tech hubs in the world, as well as not having people under investigation. I'm just gonna throw that out.
I mean, I don't think that that's an unreasonable ask. So
You would think, right? You would think, but when systems are no longer monitored, they don't get checked. And that's honestly a big part of what's brought about the current political climate that we have here in Utah. And we have some great elected officials. Do not get me wrong. We have some really fantastic elected officials. There are so many of them who are just there to do the work that they were elected for. There are so many bureaucrats, like you mentioned, there's so many attorneys in the AG's office who are there to do the work that they were hired to do. And they do it well. And it all kind of gets erased almost by the bad behavior of other people. And that's not fair to them. It's not fair to us. It's not fair to our economy. It's not fair to our investors. It's not fair. It's just not fair. And so making Utah a more fair state, I think is got to be a priority of not only our community, but the community at large.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that you know, getting involved and being aware is like the first thing. Some of the things that I always look forward to are your newsletters, especially during session, just to be what's going on. And then I know like Kyle Treasure has his podcast Inside the Hive that does like a fun breakdown of what's going on. But I actually, as I've gotten older, my focus has gone like very like global, national, just down to like very hyper local, because I know that there's more I can do here locally than I can, you know, on a national stage. And it's fun to be able to work with, you know, local elected officials that actually like are managing, you know, legislation or regulation or anything that has to do with my business, that has to do with my family, where I live, you know, the schools and all of that. And that's been like really rewarding. And we have a lot of really fantastic people. And I'm sure it's really frustrating for those that, you know, where you get one, you know, bad apple and then that kind of taints, you know, what everybody thinks about everyone else. Because we do have some people that work extremely hard and do it for all the right reasons and don't make a lot of money doing it. And they do it because they love our state.
Yeah, they absolutely do. And they deserve way more credit and way more FaceTime than I think they're getting right now. And it's important to highlight that work, but it's also important to recognize that their work can only succeed and their work cannot be undone if we have a lack of corruption in public office. And it's not a huge problem here. It seems to be primarily in one office. Don't know why.
Well, I'm going to just put a plug that someone should produce the Cry of Freedom or whatever that's called. And we hold auditions. Yeah. So
maybe that'll be a side project of ours during the legislative session. We'll release slow
like cosplay it like in the rotunda. Yeah. Okay. Got
exactly,
it. Yeah.
exactly. You know, some flags behind us and a big leather chair, and I can't remember what.
Only if Kanye gave it to us.
Only if Kanye well, you know what we should do? We should just put a stamp on it that says from Kanye, you know,
From Kanye.
or whatever. Yeah, no, we absolutely should. I think that would be amazing. So now we're going to kick it over to anybody who might have questions. So this question is, how can we as business people best get involved in politics without coming off as awkward ourselves? Thinking about when other corporations get political and it goes really poorly. My first rule, first and foremost, is don't be a dumbass. And when I say don't be a dumbass, I mean don't be a dumbass. Like if you're walking into a room full of people who their entire work day is spent on this one issue, don't walk in uninformed, right? You need to make sure that you know what you're talking about. So when we're talking about getting involved in politics specifically, everyone is awkward, everyone is weird. We are all the nerdy people. We're all the nerdy people that had like a special nerd table at the cafeteria. So nothing you can do will be weirder than the things we've already experienced or done. And I'm counting myself in that, as having worked for several state governments. I know that I'm that weirdo and I own it and I wrap myself in it. But there are a lot of different ways. So especially in Utah, we're going to be doing some delegate trainings towards the beginning of the year. So all of this is nonpartisan. There are caucus nights. Sunny, do you want to talk about your experience being a delegate for just a second?
Yeah, I mean, you know,
roll your eyes when you say yeah.
I had heard that being a delegate was important. I didn't really understand what it was. When I was growing up, I thought people who were politically engaged were weirdos, you know, like to be honest. So I didn't really understand it, never had participated. And then there was a precinct night. Is that what it's called? Precinct night?
Your
caucus night at the school down the street. So I went, and me and my husband went, and then they put you in these rooms. Again, I don't know what I don't know, so I just give them my information. They tell me which room to go, and at that point, you're gonna pick you're gonna vote for your delegates. I plan to just go and like hopefully, vote for who I thought was great. I read the room. I was like, maybe I need to throw my hat in the ring. So I did. And I was asked questions, and then like it was voted. I mean, there was like 7 people there. It just wasn't like a big deal. And then what that did was, then when the 2 people that were running in the primary, they like contacted me and texted me and wanted to meet with me and chat, and so definitely got a lot more one-on-one attention from them. And then I went to the caucus or whatever, the state convention, so did that. um it's weird because it's not in your, but there are people who go every year, and I don't think that there are a lot of demographics that are missing from these groups. And sometimes like there's not even enough people, that it's just whoever shows up gets selected. There were some rooms where no one showed up, so they didn't have anyone, and I don't know what they do in that situation. But like once I went through it, it wasn't that intimidating, but it's one of those things where I'm like, oh yeah, like I would have not I didn't know what to expect. And so everything felt foreign, and it feels weird to, pull yourself out of the comfort of your own home. But I did know that I wanted to have input, and this was like the best way to have input.
And so there was, because we're a super majority state, that means a lot of our local legislative districts are going to be Republican. It's cool. It happens. It happens all across the country with various parties. But there was a situation most recently after we utilized the newest maps after the census, voting maps. If you don't know what that is, that's a whole nother drama. If you're ever really interested in reality TV, politics is where it's at. Just going to throw that out there. But there was a senator who was redistricted in a way that was very shady, and it looked like they were trying to push him out. And he, instead of collecting signatures or going to a primary, he didn't have a primary opponent. He had a caucus opponent, but not a primary opponent. And so he goes to convention, and a single vote determined who the elected official was for around 150,000 Utahns. One person, one solitary person, determined who was going to represent 150,000 people. And that is why our delegate system is so important. And that's one of the reasons why when Sunny and I were talking about it, I encouraged her to become a delegate if it was, and if she had that opportunity. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, like January, February, leading up to the caucus nights as well. But we have a weird system here in Utah. We have a caucus convention system, where instead of just random elections, we do the delegate process. So you go on a Tuesday night, normally in March. A lot of times it's your local elementary school. You sit down with 5 or 10 people, or no one, you're the only one there, like in my district here in Salt Lake. You can have knockdown, drag out fights for that delegate, that right to be a delegate at the county or state convention. Or you could have, like what Sunny mentioned, and what my husband experienced last year, was someone reaching out and being like, oh, hey, nobody showed up at this place, so we have this extra vote. Do you want it? And that determines the political and policy future of 150,000 Utahns. It's just bonkers to me. So whether or not you like it, I think the best way to get involved is to get to know your neighbors. And the best way to do that is to go to caucus night. Even if you don't run for delegate, which you are not required to do, if you go to your caucus night, you will understand more about what your area cares about and what is being discussed. And that is huge. That is absolutely huge. I live on the west side of Salt Lake City in Poplar Grove. Shout out to my peeps over here. But our community councils, which are these pseudo-elected, not really government entities that have a lot of power with the city or whatever, they are talking about things that I honestly don't care about. What I care about is my kid being able to walk down the street without getting hit by a car. Like, that's what I would prefer to be talking about. But because I'm not there every Wednesday that they have those meetings, I can't bring that up. So make yourself available. Know that it's probably max like a 20-hour total time commitment, depending on how much you want to put in. You've got your caucus night, you have your county convention, and then if you're a state delegate, you have your state convention. And state conventions are terrible, and we will be your friend at state convention no matter what. So you do have friends in all of these places.
I think it's like bare minimum is to vote. Like the next step would to go to your precinct night like that. Oh, sorry, my Zoom.
You got balloons, yay!
Yeah. This always happens. I can't remember, but
I
yeah.
don't remember what I did, but I got a whole bunch of things on it, and I was like,
Yeah.
I wasn't expecting that.
Zach showed them to me. So.
Are there any updates or any chance with the anti-gerrymandering lawsuit? Will this lead to any changes? So I do not have any updates on the anti-gerrymandering lawsuit. The last I heard was the Utah Supreme Court questions that were supposed to be more about process, but they actually asked more questions about the meat of the lawsuit, which is a good indicator that they're going to make a big decision. But what that decision is, I don't think anybody knows yet. And will it lead to change? Sunny, you want to take on that one?
I don't think we count on it. I mean, like maybe there is, but I think the reality is we just need more people to be delegates. We need more people to be involved. We need more people to run for office, all of these things that take effort, because, there is going to be new maps every 10 years. And this whole gerrymandering thing could be a 10-year thing. So, yeah.
Exactly. If you've ever followed a lawsuit, you can understand how so many of us have a lack of hope purely because of the timeline, not necessarily because of the quality of the actual lawsuit itself, merely just because of the timeline. Like, I think in the national press right now, there's a lot of conversations about different lawsuits and will they conclude before the 2024 election. And that's just the way our judicial system works, is at a snail's pace, without the defendant waiving significant rights, which is their right to have. So you just run into the time barriers. And if at some point in time it becomes moot to continue talking about that, a judge will throw it out. They'll just be like, nope, doesn't matter anymore. Sorry, guys, peace, So we are watching that one carefully. It will be interesting to see what happens. Most gerrymandering lawsuits are won based off of racial discrimination. Political discrimination is what I think most of Utah yells the loudest about, myself included. But that is actually not a protected class, even though several groups have tried to make it one, but it is not a protected class and therefore cannot be considered. But again, it's the weird language, guys, the weird language of the law. And if you want to have a good and healthy future, you got to go to your caucus night. It's that simple. And it sounds dumb, but that's the way it works. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, I am going to wrap this up by reading a quote from the lawsuit against our current Attorney General. This is an excerpt of what he wrote for himself, or the character that he portrays. So screenplay this for me. Reyes describes himself in the scene as energetic, Hawaiian, Hispanic, Asian, of larger build, former MMA fighter, now elected official, in conservative suit behind large rosewood desk in ceremonial office. I don't know what a conservative suit is. Anybody?
Mr. Mac. Yeah, Mr. Mac. Yeah.
That's not a conservative. Like, I don't think I would ever use the word conservative for Mr. Mac. Maybe it's
right. The missionaries buy their suits. I figure. Yeah.
That's why they're the cheap
ones. The missionary package. Yeah.
You can get like 3 suits and like 5 dress shirts for crazy cheap. It's great. It's really
Yeah. You don't need something expensive. You're not going to keep it longer than 2 years.
Well, I don't know. Mr. Sundance over here in his specialty beanie and t-shirt, he might disagree. So I think in the Cries of Freedom, this guy's name is David Reyes, right? Like they share the same last name. It's so weird. But the character's name is David Reyes. So if there is a Cries of Freedom sequel to Sound of Freedom, I commit this to you now. I will find a way to do a Utah Tech Lead screening, and we can all
Oh,
have
you know what? We could just have like AI read the parts.
yeah, to each other, like the bots. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. We could totally produce this. Yeah, done.
It'll be
I
awesome.
don't know if we need to like ask for permission, but yeah.
It'll be like early YouTube days. It'll be fantastic. It'll be trashy and gross and weird and hilarious and awesome. So again, you like reality television, you gotta get involved and stay informed. Thank you so much, Sunny, for joining us. We really appreciate your time, and thank all of you for joining us today. Let us know if you've got questions. We are here, Utah Tech Leads Trade Association, to support you. So thank you so much and have a great day.